As you already know, Jennifer Voitlin is Assessment 24/7's Director of Certification, Coach Mentor, Professional Values Analyst, and Instructional Designer for Client Customization and Resource Development. In Jen's presentation of the highlights of the Motivators report, she will share with us details of each of the motivators as presented in the report, and the importance of reviewing the 7 dimensions as a whole. She'll also briefly share why the motivators are important, either when used on their own to create awareness of why we do what we do, or used in partnership with DISC. With this information, we know that you can be more prepared to work with your clients to help them understand how to drive passion, reduce fatigue, and create inspiration. Here's Jen.
Thank you. Thank you. How is everybody doing after lunch? So I figure I got about 20 minutes before the food coma starts to set in. I teased someone earlier that if I saw them sleeping and they started to snore, I was going to throw something at them. So I'm going to do my best to stay a little bit engaging and hopefully be informative. What I will tell you is this is going to be one side of the motivators conversation. You are going to get a lot more about motivators when we hear Steve speak. But I'm going to give you what's in the report and how the report works with the content that he's going to be bringing to the table during his segment. So there may be some things that we overlap on. The really good news is he trained me. So hopefully we say the same kinds of things, which would be wonderful. That said, our intention today is to look at what's in the Motivators report and talk about why it is that we offer it. So I hear there are questions like, well, we do DISC, isn't that enough? No, no, it's not. And well, what's this motivators thing? Why is that something that we would want to take advantage of, or why would we use that? So one of the things that we're going to talk about right out of the gate is what is motivators and why is it beneficial? So motivators help people to better understand their unique value hierarchy or belief system. So they can learn about the things that really drive and guide and filter their decisions based on the things that are most important to them. The second one says, filtering and guiding decisions specifically toward results that reflect them. So motivators can help us see what are the things where we should be focusing on or put our focus to have the greatest satisfaction with who we are. And finally, combine uniquely for each person to influence individual priorities and decision making. So one of the things that we're going to talk about are the individual motivators and how they are defined. But the reality is that none of them can be separated from one another. They all have impact on who we are. They all work together to become this vision of what filters and guides our decisions. Now, behavior and motivators are connected. So behavior, how we act, is determined by our emotion, which is how we feel. And the motivators are the reasons that drive us to want to do that. So whatever it might be, they're the things that are the why behind the what. So if behavior is what we do, motivators are why we do it, okay? Now there's a lot of different things that play into the determination of our behavior. Behavior sometimes wins over motivation, which we can talk about separately if you'd like to. It's a fascinating concept for me. But generally speaking, the motivators are the things that drive the decisions that turn into behaviors. So a couple of things for us to consider. As I just said, behaviors are actions, values are motivators and our desires, and our axiology or our views cannot be separated. They can be distinguished. We can look at them individually, but we have to combine them together to see the impact that they have on us. They do not stand alone. Motivators influence one another to create our mindset and filter our decisions. So let's dive into the importance of this. I want you to take a minute. I want you to turn to the person next to you and talk about why it would make a difference to understand someone's motivator. It's different than our own. Go ahead. I'll give you a minute. All right, so I would love to know what some of your thoughts are around why knowing someone's motivators would be important. Okay, I realize we haven't talked about them. We don't really know what they are yet, but I would love to know why it would be important to know the differences. Anybody want to share? So I can sell them. Joyce? so you can work with people with ease, okay? Okay? I saw another hand over here somewhere. Didn't I? No? So you know who to marry. Oh, yes. Even though that's a broad statement for what to look for when it comes to that. There's a lot we could go into about that too. But yes, understanding who to marry, part of it, Rich. Any other reasons why it might be helpful to know what motivates someone differently than you? Yes?
Maybe you can use that to your advantage to help them more.
To use that to your advantage to help them more. Tell me more what you mean by that.
If somebody's
Thank you.
If somebody is motivated to help the world, then you use that I'm a business coach, so I use that in business coaching to help them become more successful in business, if that's their motivation.
Yeah,
And
good.
in other ways too. Yeah.
Good, good. One of the things that I love that I learned from Steve was that it's important to remember that we see the world as we are. And so we expect that the world is going to be as we want it to be, or it's going to behave in the way we would behave. And that is not true. So having yet another thing to pay attention to that can help us to see why we're different and how people respond differently to different things like values and behaviors is really helpful in building our awareness, not only of ourselves, but the awareness of others and knowing how to be more successful with them. So if we see people as we are, we don't always think about how they might be different than we are, but we can certainly see conflict that comes from that difference. Yeah, Laura.
So I've worked with some people that were using this now as a hiring tool. And so I've had a couple. Okay, so in using this as a hiring tool, and especially in a small office, just recently, within the last couple of months, the owner had, I'll just say, one set of motivators, and the person he was considering hiring had the exact opposite on every single one. And he goes, Laura, this kind of scares me, should it? And I said, yes. Yes. But I mean, like, he was a super high economic, and the person he was hiring was extremely low. He's a low altruistic, and she's like way up there 80. You know, and so it helps, I think, for people when they're hiring, because they're wanting to build a culture, to take a look at motivators on top of the disc, or in addition to. The other thing is, I've seen in very successful companies where their motivators are very, very similar, even though their disc styles are not.
Sure.
And this particular company of 60 employees, the management staff was almost identical, and they've been in business for over 25 years.
Okay.
And that was, in discussing it with them, one of the things that I learned from them is it's one of the things that makes them successful.
Okay. So they have a lot of the similar foundation behind their behaviors, even if their behaviors show up differently.
Oh, their behaviors are all over the map. And that's what kind of blew me away is that I was just sharing with our team over here, in one particular case, the behavioral styles, one's 98D and the other's like a 3. and then the guy that's a 3D, a low D, is a 98S, and the high D is a 2S.
Right.
And you would think they would never get along, but their motivators are almost exactly identical.
Interesting.
And oddly enough, they are friends at work and outside of work. And to boot, they have found a way to cope in the management teams where the low D says, you know, Jeff, you go take him on with that. And then what he does is he, of course, is the team and the glue with, you know, that holds everybody together with his 98S.
Interesting. So sometimes that can be the case where you have very similar motivators, and so you have wonderful results that come from that. But there's also, just like with DISC, you know, there's a benefit to being very different as well. You can see things differently, you can experience things differently, you can build greater productivity if you don't have the same mindset, the same drivers. So either of those scenarios is not a bad one. Finding a way to work within it is the power, right? Understanding that we're different helps us to create some bridges and connection between what drives our behavior, what drives their behavior, and how can we come to a common goal. So let's look at this. Thank you much for that, Laura. Let's look at this a little bit more in terms of our report. So when we look at the Motivators report, this report is short in comparison to DISC. It's much more simplistic in its presentation. It has an introduction that tells you what the motivators are, and we're going to look at all of this in just a minute. It also has a summary with scoring that's personal for that individual. And it provides it in a graphic form as well as statement sets that talk about each motivator and how they show up in that area based on their assessment. Then you have an individual page devoted to each of the motivators that provides information in 5 key areas. And I'll show that to you in just a second too, but you do have a single page for every motivator. And then lastly, you have application exercises to bring those motivators to life, look at how they are impacting your behavior, look at if you're in alignment in that area, how they lead to success, and how they may limit you, depending on what your circumstances are. So this information, as I said, is presented in a pretty short format. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of places to take it and have a lot of conversation. In fact, when I do a motivators debrief, I spend about 4 minutes going through the assessment, and I spend about an hour on 1 page. And we'll talk about that too. So this is the 7 dimensions of motivation. This is what is presented in that introductory information of the assessment. So when we're looking at why are motivators important, this is really helpful in identifying what it is that we're examining here. So these 7 different areas, aesthetic, economic, individualistic, political, altruistic, regulatory, and theoretical, are the dimensions that are being measured. These are the motivators that are a part of the motivations report, okay? I know some other companies and some other models don't use 7 individual motivators. We do. This is the way that they're outlined for us, and there is a little short definition here. So much more to it than what's just presented here, but this gives you an idea and a reminder of what kinds of things that we're looking at. Now, it's important to know that each of these motivators has a need or a want that has to be satisfied for us to feel like we are our best selves. So as we look through each of these and talk about the definitions here for just a minute, I'd like for you to pay attention to which one feels the strongest for you. And I'm going to have you share that with the person next to you if you're comfortable when we're finished going through all 7. So the first one is the aesthetic. This is the drive for balance, harmony, and form. There are lots of different ways that I've heard this explained in the time that I've used this assessment. I know Steve will talk more about this in his presentation as well, but ultimately what we're looking at here is, are we high in aesthetic or low in aesthetic? And what does that mean? Again, low is not bad, high is not good. It's just a matter of how they work and show up for us. So it's not a low scores mean I need to change, high scores mean I'm awesome. It's just that our characteristics and the way we express ourselves and the things that are important to us are different based on our score. We're going to talk more about scoring in just a few minutes. For aesthetic, the need that's associated with this particular driver is self-expression. There's a word that we associate with how this looks, and the word is alternative. So the higher you are in this dimension, the more alternative you may be in your actions and the things that drive you. The lower you are in this area, the more traditional or standard you might be, more realistic, practical, useful in your approach. So there's an element of that that exists here as well. The second one is the economic, a drive for economic or practical returns. Most of the time people will say, oh, those people care all about money. That's all about money. No, it's not. Economic does have a money element that's involved with it. What we're looking at here, though, is am I getting a return on my investment? It doesn't necessarily have to be a monetary return. It could be time, attention, energy, results. There's lots of different things that can come from a return on investment. In addition to that, the word that I used that was given to me to associate economic is competitive. I want to win. It's a competition. If I'm high economic, I'm going to win and be competitive about what I do. Individualistic, the next one. This is the drive to stand out as independent and unique. So this is the desire to have autonomy, to be independent, to do something special, to contribute in a special way. Steve will describe this, I'm sure, as the red penny in a jar full of pennies. This is someone who wants to stand out and do something a little bit different than everybody else. If you're really high in that, maybe a lot different than everyone else. If you're lower in individualistic, you don't have that same drive to stand out. There's a lot of collaboration that comes from being lower in this area. Political. Political is the drive for influence and control. Now, this has nothing to do with politics. A lot of people think if I'm high in political, that means I'm into politics. Not necessarily. But this does have to do with wanting to have influence and control over your situation. and being able to manage your situation effectively. Lower political, that drive for control and influence doesn't always show up the same way. You might say, all right, you take this one, I'll go along for the ride. Altruistic. Altruistic is one of my favorite because it's usually mischaracterized. So altruistic, as it says up here, a drive for humanitarian efforts or to help others. Much of the time, people will say, well, if someone's low altruistic, that means they don't care about anybody. No, that's not true. Altruism, at its highest form, is giving to others and helping others at the expense of self. Low altruism means I get to be discerning about who I give to and help. So it's not that they don't care about people if they're low altruistic. They absolutely could care about people. They just express that care in a very different way, through very different means. Regulatory is a drive to establish order, routine, and structure. So as the name states, it's a very regulated approach to the world. It's creating systems in place to help us be effective. It's traditional black and white thinking versus being very flexible and having a very open-minded approach if you're low regulatory. Lastly, we have theoretical. This is the drive for knowledge, learning, and understanding. The higher you are in this, the more that drive is knowledge for knowledge's sake. You want to know everything that there is to know. You want to be the expert in whatever it is that you can present. Lower in this drive is more of a situational learner, someone who would operate in trial and error and see what works. They probably want to know just enough to be dangerous, sometimes just enough to be successful. They're more of a specialist, not necessarily needing to have all of the information to be successful. Okay, so take a second, think about what's up on the screen, which one might resonate the most with you that you can feel like, oh yeah, that one's really strong in who I am and what really drives me, and share with your neighbor if you will. Do you have some aesthetic in you?
Some what?
Some aesthetic?
No.
No? You're low aesthetic?
Kind of middle of the road.
Okay, okay.
It's just the same organization, the organization we were in.
Yep.
They said the trick is when you're writing and you forget what target gets stuck, just drop it, pick up a different color.
Oh.
But what I learned is when I write with different colors, it's easier to read, but I can cram more information.
So it's a system that works then.
Because then now, monochrome looks boring.
Yeah.
This is like jealous. I'm not going to take his pen.
Yes, you
Put them in the middle. There you go. All right. So I would like for you to recall that I said earlier that these don't stand alone, right? These don't stand alone. So it might be really difficult to say that one feels like it's my highest because they have different influences. They pull on each other in different ways. But I would love to know, based on what you know so far, how many of you think that you have high aesthetic? Not necessarily as your primary, but definitely high aesthetic. Okay? Okay. How many of you think you are high economic? How many of you think that you're high individualistic? Okay. What about my high political? 2 hands even, all right? Are high altruistic? Okay, very cool. High regulatory? 1? Yes. Oh, 2. Nice, and they got to sit by each other. Oh, there's another one.
I would like to be, but I can't pull it off.
That's fair enough. I pull it off enough for everybody. What about my high theoreticals? Nice, nice. So what's the point of having you all raise your hand and tell us what you think you are? Yes, to show that we all have differences, right? We all have different things that influence who we are and that drive our behaviors and guide and filter our decisions. So are we always going to have the same ideas, the same results, the same consequence? No. No, there's lots of different mixes that are available. As they say, it takes all kinds. And gosh, aren't we great that we can provide all kinds? So cool. All right, so let's look at what this looks like from a scoring perspective. So when we score the motivators, as I said before, it's not a matter of low and high. There's an element of that that's important. But what we look at instead is what is the impact that that low or high has on me. So I know it's really light, but if you look back here, you can kind of see that there's a bar graph in the back of the screen that shows you a line through several of these areas. That line indicates the average score for that motivator. And what we're looking for is which of our motivators are furthest from that average score, either high or low. Now, when you have the report, you'll see language like you have low or high or average or very high in this location. That is based on the number score that you receive. And what that can look like is either a very low score or a very high score operating as a potential risk, low, average, and high being something that will have an effect on your behavior, but it may affect your behavior differently than someone else who also has a low or an average or high. So again, we want to pay attention to the very low and very highs because those can represent a specific strength or challenge for us in some regard. But this is how the scoring is produced from numbers. Now let's look at impact scoring, which is different. So average scores, things that fall within the mid-range. And when you look at your reports, you'll see that there is a box plot that is presented right around the range of where each of these lines is. That's the general population. And if you fall within that box plot, you are like most of the people in that area. 68% of the population falls within the box plot. You are going to be average, creating a normal degree of influence. So people are not going to necessarily see that as different in you. If you are far outside of that, away from that norm line, either high or low, the degree to which you are high or low is going to make a difference and impact your choices. If you're very high above it, the impact is going to be one way. If you are very low below it, the impact will look totally different, but they may have the same impact. Does that make sense? Do this, if it does. If it doesn't, do this. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit more. Here's a darker picture for you to see. When we look at where you fall, as I mentioned, the levels that are considered really high, so above 85, they have a different kind of risk associated with them. The risk is that instead of having a want in that area that needs to be fulfilled, like I want to be altruistic and help people, it goes to I need to have that fulfilled. So the higher our score, the more that becomes a need. If we're above an 85, that need is going to absolutely have an impact on how our behavior plays out. Now, wants turning into needs. What's the difference? There are crass ways that this can be described. Things like, I want a brownie versus I need a brownie. Or, I want to lead versus I need to lead. I want to win versus I need to win. Does it feel different? Want versus need? Yes. What happens if we need something? What do? We adjust our behavior to get it. We create the opportunity to make that be true for us and to satisfy that need. Okay, wants, yeah. All right, I want a brownie, maybe I'll get one later on. If I need a brownie, y'all are on your own. I'm going to get a brownie, right? It's a different opportunity, it's a different experience, it's a different persuasion or influence on the behaviors that we choose. And it's something to pay a lot of attention to. All right, so when we review the motivators, the first thing that I do is I look at the motivator statements and the scores. This is on page 5 of the report. And this is specific to how they answer the assessment. So it gives you the graph, like we can see in the background, and those individualized statements that are customized to their score. Then we look at which of the scores have the greatest impact on our behavior. So which are the highest above the line, which are the lowest above the line, and what happens when those influence our behavior. What does that look like? Finally, or thirdly, reviewing supporting or conflicting relationships. So Steve, I'm sure, will talk about how some of these motivators have relationships with others that either support and strengthen in that regard, or they conflict, which strengthens it another way in that regard. Finally, we discuss if they're effectively aligning the motivators and the behaviors. Now, if you haven't had somebody do DISC, you don't always know if their motivators are in alignment with their behavior. We can look at a motivators graph and determine likelihood of what this person might look like based on what we see. And yet until we see their behaviors, we don't know if that's how they're showing up or if that isn't how they are showing up. If you have both, it's wonderful to be able to create a more holistic picture of how are the motivators showing up through the behaviors. And if they don't, why not? Why not? All right, so as I said, when you're looking through the report, not only do you have the summary of all of the things that are available based on their score on the one page, but you also have individual motivators pages. There's 7 of them, 1 for each motivator. At the top of the page, you'll see that person's scoring in each of those areas. So you have a reminder on every page what their scoring graph looks like. You also have a definition of what the dimension is holding or covering, or what's present in there for them. Then I said before, you've got 5 key areas on these individual pages. You've got general traits, key strengths, motivational insights, training and learning insights, and continual improvement insights. Within each of those areas, you have bullet points that are specific to that person's score. So everybody will have the 5 areas, everybody will have the 7 pages. The bullet points will be different based on their individual scoring that you can see up here. Why is that important if we look at motivators as a whole and they can't be separated? Well, because even though they can't be separated, we can identify areas where we may need to modify or bring in additional resources or consider things from a new perspective. And each of these pages offers more individual insight into that motivator and how it influences us. All right, lastly, we have a couple of pages of application activities. One page that gives you an opportunity to see how relevant are your motivators to your behaviors. So you choose your top 2 most influential motivators, and you determine if they are highly aligned with your behavior or not highly aligned with your behavior. And then based on that, look at how can I align them better if they're not, or what kind of success can I work toward given that they are aligned. So you have the opportunity to fill that out yourself. And then following that page, there's a page about supporting successes and limiting successes based on what you know about your motivators. How do I embrace them to be as successful as possible, or how do they prevent me from being able to get what I want? So as I said, it's a very, very short report when it comes to providing a lot of pages to read through, and yet full of information and can be used in a variety of ways to support people. This piece of it is something that we've added to our resources site. So just like we have DISC trainer materials, we have Motivators Trainer materials. And this is a piece that we've added that's available for you, again, in that same place we talked about before on your admin site toward the bottom, or we have links for it that we can send you as well. And what I designed here is a way to have a conversation with someone about their motivators so that you can educate them in what motivations are influencing them. Someone told me once that the word educate comes from the Latin for drawing forth. So the intention behind this is not to answer the questions for them, it's to draw forth their own conclusions and understanding based on what the Motivators report presents. So some of the things that we have up here: open-ended, purposeful follow-up questions to uncover opportunities and reveal areas of support if it's needed. Ask them, what are the primary motivators based on what we see here? How do those show up in your world? And how do those link to your behaviors? What kind of relationships do you see? What awareness do they have about their scores? Do they seem high? Do they seem low? Are they right where they would expect them to be? Are those scores accurate and reflective of their mindset? How do those motivators and mindsets influence their choices and behaviors? How does that actually work in their world? Have them give you concrete examples of what you see there. Are their behaviors reflecting their wants accurately? If not, why not? And should something be done to align them? So I said before that behavior is going to trump motivation. It's going to be more powerful than motivation. The first time I heard that, and times since then that I've told people, the general response is, that doesn't seem right. It seems like our motivators would be stronger than our behavior. And our motivators drive our behavior, so why would we not behave in alignment with our motivators? And the reality is that there's a lot of different reasons why we may behave differently than we want to behave. Our wants may not be reflected in our behaviors. So again, having both to look at is really, really helpful versus one or the other. Yes, Don?
What's the reason for that, Jen? Is it habit structure?
Why they may not be aligned? What's the reason for that? There can be lots of reasons. There can be lots of reasons why that happens. Typically, what I've seen, and I'm sure Steve could bring some more light to this as well, but what I've seen is that you may have a desire to do one thing or be one thing or manage one way in your life, and yet there is a circumstance that prevents that. So for example, if I'm a very high economic person and I want something, I want a return for my investment, and I'm in a relationship with someone who is a very low economic person and they don't ever want anything in return for their investment, and we don't see eye to eye, I may change my behavior not to appear as economic as I am, or vice versa. If I'm low economic and my husband is very high economic, I may have to look at things from his perspective and behave in a way that is more in alignment with him, because the strength of my marriage depends on that. So there could be situations like that in play. If you were in a very controlling relationship, you may desire to be the person in control, but if you're with someone who's much more controlling than you may in fact take a back seat to that. Not because you want to be less controlling, but because it may not work. So that's just some of the examples of ways that that could show up. And I'm sure Steve will have more to offer about that in his time as well, in regard to why it is that that happens. But it's really interesting to think about that what we want may not actually be expressed in what we do. And it doesn't necessarily change that we want it, but the way that it's coming out or not coming out can look very different ways. We may still want to be in control and yet not able to be.
Is it really the primary reason why 50% of people hate their jobs?
I don't know if it's the primary reason why 50% of people hate their jobs or not.
They're not aligned.
I think that there's a lot of reasons why people lack satisfaction in areas of their life. And yes, I think a very large contributor to that is misalignment. But a lot of the time, my experience is when they look at their graph, they say, oh, that explains so much. I didn't even know that that's why I did that. So they don't even have awareness of why it is that they're dissatisfied. Once you bring to light the things that really drive them, if they can create alignment in their behaviors, create alignment in their thinking and their behaviors and their motivations, we can reach satisfaction much more easily. That's not to say that it's ever going to be easy, because it won't necessarily be. But yeah, there's a lot of that can stand in the way of us feeling fulfilled. I think a lot of people hate their jobs because they hate their managers. You know, but it's misalignment, right? We're not on the same page.
Or their motivators don't align with the company culture.
Exactly, that's a possibility too. Motivators may not align with the company culture or the sales process or what they're involved in. You know, I've heard of a lot of people who have become more discerning in the interviewing process, where they'll look at, how do I fit this company? Not just how does this company fit with me. It's a give and take. And do I fit this culture? Is this in alignment with my value system? Because the reality is, if we're out of alignment with our values, we can only sustain that for a certain period of time. Then, as I talked about with DISC, stuff's gonna start leaking out. And if our values are off base enough, that's gonna cause a lot of turmoil at some point. Whether internal stress, expression of external stress, or things like you get up one day and you walk out and say, I can't work for this anymore. And people are like, what happened? Everything was fine. No, everything wasn't fine. You've been out of alignment too long. Yeah, all those things are very, very possible, and more. Any other questions? Okay, is this helpful for understanding a little bit more about what motivators do, why they're helpful? You'll get more about this from the guru himself. Yes?
The one thing I didn't hear you express, and I'm sure it's
No.
It really is, it has to be looked at in context to the situation each and every time. So high altruistic would be perfect in a social environment where they're, helping people, and they don't even need another motivator. If that's the one thing that they love. So it's not like you have to have all these motivators.
Well, everybody has them all. Okay, it's just like DISC. So we all have all four, right? We're all DIS and C in some regard. Motivators is true the same way. And if you think about it on a scale system going from the center line up and the center line down as opposed to from 0 to 100, we all have them in some varying degree. None of the scores are good or bad, whether we're high or lower, not good or bad. What it does, though, is gives us an indication of what that might look like based on what that person thinks and believes. So if I'm high in this one and you're low in the same one, that doesn't mean that you're more successful or less successful, or that I'm good and you're bad, or that I'm bad and you're good. We just have different perspectives. And they have the same kinds of impact, just in different ways. That said, just like the scoring isn't right or wrong, none of the motivators are right or wrong. So if you're economic, that doesn't make you a big jerk. A lot of people think, oh, well, if they're high economic, all they're in it for is money, and that makes them a big jerk. No. If you're high altruistic, that doesn't mean that you're going to love people all the time no matter what, and you're like a soft-hearted, sweet, wonderful person. Not like that. You might want to be a giving, generous, wonderful person, but sometimes your behavior may not show up that way. It's not because you're not a kind, giving, wonderful person. You might be having a bad day. So there's all sorts of different things that can go into it. None of the motivators are bad at any level. They're all wonderful and all necessary. And we have to have a balance of a lot of different pieces of these kinds of perspectives to be able to be successful too. Yes, Rich.
From a marketing perspective, the buy-in of this in terms of relationship to this, how many companies, organizations, coaches are using this? Is it growing in popularity?
It is growing in popularity. In my experience, not enough is the correct answer. The question was, how many people are actually using DISC and motivators in combination? Is motivators catching on with growing popularity? It should. I have always been, in all the years that I've been experiencing DISC, and that's been a while, almost 10 of them, in all those years that I've been experiencing DISC, I always thought DISC is amazing. I love DISC. DISC is where it's at. Really, I'm good with just doing DISC. Then I learned about motivators, and I thought, what the heck have I been missing? Because this gives us so much more insight into why that happens, that they're that way. And a lot of people don't care why, they just want to know what. Why do I behave the way? Because I do, is the answer that you get most of the time. I don't know why, just because, that's what I do. But it gives us so much more insight into the things that can drive our relationships either down or up if we have different kinds of awareness. I would not want anyone to do motivators by themselves and not incorporate DISC. I don't want anybody to do DISC by themselves and not incorporate motivators because I think it's too powerful when you put it together. Can you do them separately? Absolutely. But when you can see how they work with each other, why would you want to? Why would you want to? Yes.
Are the midpoint lines or the graphical lines, are those, what data or how much data are they based on? And do they change as more and more people take it, kind of like with the Gallup data? They're constantly updating.
Sure. I'm not sure where the norms come from this. Jay, do you know where the norms come from, the assessment? Or Tony? Do you know where the norms for motivators come from?
Just like I was explaining this morning, the norms are a composite of everybody who's taken the assessment before.
So thousands and thousands and thousands of people who've taken the assessment. It's a composite of them. And this norm represents the average score. So if you took all the scores, divided them, this is the center of the score. Okay? And then the box plot on each side is one standard deviation above and below that average score. What was your second part of the question? Does it shift?
As more and more people, kind of take this?
As we pull the norm reports again, it could shift. There are shifts that happen. For example, in the regulatory line, the scale for regulatory is really interesting. So if you look at the scoring, if you've got it in front of you or someone next to you, where the box plot sits on the regulatory line is a little bit lower, and it's also smaller than all the other motivators. Now, what's interesting about that is as humanity progresses, we go from being more traditional, more black and white, more right and wrong focused, to being much more open, much more flexible, much more aware that there are lots of different perspectives that perhaps we should embrace. So that box is actually dropping as people become more open-minded and more willing to accept mindsets other than their own. You know, when we were never thought of yet, you know, grandparents, great-grandparents, and that generations behind us or in front of us, they had a much more traditional, much more limited opportunity to think about things the way we do now. They didn't have the resources we had, they didn't have the availability of different kinds of lifestyles that we have, so their perspectives were much smaller. As we work toward being more open and embracing a lot of different things, that gap is increasingly getting shorter and shorter and moving down and down and down. That one shifts. The other ones, I think they stay pretty darn similar, but they've got a much wider range as well than that regulatory does. Thank you. Yes, Todd.
So if I were to pitch this to my organization on the value of Motivator, is it more of a self-reflection from the individual employee, or is it so the employer can then apply the specific tasks or job description towards what motivates that individual?
Both.
So can you?
Yes.
'Cause it's a big difference, right?
There can be. So one side of it is this is self-perception, right? I took the assessment, I put the statements in order to determine what my motivation is. So there is a self-perception piece of it. The other side of that is as an employer or as a company or as a coach, you can look at, does this kind of style, does this motivational conglomeration fit with what we're trying to do? If it doesn't, is there something that can be done about that? There are graphs that can predict, which is kind of a strong word, but graphs that can predict what someone is going to do based on what we can see in the things that drive their behavior. We can see if they're going to leave their job in a week. We can see if they're very satisfied with what they're doing. We can see if their job is in alignment with the things that drive them most. And so by having the opportunity to see that, we can do something about it. Now, sometimes the doing something about that is, you know what, we're way off base here. This is not the place. Or I can see that you're not happy here. What can we do about it? Because maybe you are not interested in being an accountant, and that's what we needed. Is there something else that would be a better fit for you based on the things that drive you that you can be really passionate about? We had this conversation at lunch where if we're passionate and engaged in our work and we're satisfied with the things that we're doing, our results can be exponential. So that's where the buy comes from, if you will. When you're pitching it to somebody, well, how successful do you want your people to be? And I know a lot of businesses in general will say satisfaction has nothing to do with productivity. I don't care if you're happy with your job, but we know that that is not the case. And if people like what they do and they feel like they like their work and the people they're working with and that they're getting the results they want, they're going to be more engaged to be more productive. Happy employees make better employees.
So that's the value pitch.
Yep. One of them. There are other ways, but that's one of them. And it's not enough just to look at behavior. Behavior is an indicator, but behavior shifts. So what's behind it that makes such a big difference for us? Joyce? Oh, he's bringing you the mic.
Hello?
Hi.
I was just going to say that I'm in healthcare, and I've been in it nearly decades. And the happier they are, the healthier they're going to be.
Yep.
And that will affect not only your bottom line with your customers, but it also affects your bottom line on your finances for all of your healthcare programs.
Mm-hmm. And it has, less sick days. You've got less people that come in a few minutes late every day just because they really don't want to be there. You have less internal communication struggles because people are engaged and they feel like they make a difference. And most people want to make a difference somehow. It's kind of a driver of humanity, is to be able to contribute what we know, right? To be accepted and to be able to contribute in one way or another. So if people have that, then they don't miss work. If they feel like what they're doing matters, they don't miss work. If they feel like that they're able to express themselves and give their very, very best in a way that supports something, they want to be more engaged. They want to come up with more solutions. They want to be more creative. They want to show up on time. They might even come in early, which is really great for our bottom line. Great questions. that's my time. So I hope this is helpful. If you have more questions about Motivators as a report or the model, or want to know anything more about additional information in it, getting certified, any of that, please don't hesitate. Thank you.